Welcome back, my friends. I'm so glad you're here for this next chapter. Last time, we watched James pour his whole heart into a meal made of corn and quiet love. And at the end of that beautiful afternoon, Diep said something that stopped everything. She said, "I think I need to see my mother again." This continues my own take on these characters and where their story might go next. Now, you might wonder, why would she go back? She had just walked away. She had closed that door so firmly. But here's the thing about a heart that is finally beginning to heal. It gets brave. Not reckless, brave. There is a difference. Diep didn't decide this alone. That night, after Nee had fallen asleep, she sat with James on the small porch outside their home. The air was cool. The guava trees were dark shapes against the evening sky. "I keep thinking about what she said," Diep told him, "that she had no choice, that someone made things difficult for her." James was quiet. He didn't rush to fill the silence. "I don't know if I believe her," Diep continued, "but I think I need to hear it properly, one more time. Not to forgive her, just to understand." James looked at her for a long moment. "Then we'll go," he said simply. "Together." Diep shook her head. "I need to go alone first, but knowing you're here when I come back, that's enough." What I find beautiful about this moment is Diep's quiet courage. She is not going back out of weakness. She is going back because she is finally strong enough to face the truth without being destroyed by it. James gave her that strength, not by solving anything, but by simply being steady, by saying, "We'll go together," without a second of hesitation. That is what real love looks like. The next morning came soft and grey. Diep dressed carefully. She told Nee she was going to run an errand in town. Nee was already busy in the garden, chasing a small frog between the guava roots, and barely looked up. James walked Diep to the edge of the path. He didn't say much. He just handed her a small bottle of water for the road and said, "Take your time." She nodded, and then she walked. The town was not far. The same small shop where she had met her mother before. The same address. Diep arrived and stood outside for a moment. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was slow. She had prepared herself for this. She pushed the door open. Her mother was already there, sitting at the same table. Hands folded, eyes red from what looked like a sleepless night. She looked up when Diep walked in, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. But here's what surprised me about what happened next. Diep sat down first. She didn't wait to be invited. She pulled out the chair herself, sat down, and looked at her mother directly. And she said, "Tell me about Mr. Hoan. Tell me everything." From the beginning, her mother blinked. This was not what she had expected, but it was exactly what was needed, because Diep was no longer the wounded girl walking away. She was a woman sitting down, ready to listen, not to excuse, but to understand. And that one small act of sitting down changed everything that came after. So there they were, two women at a small table in a quiet town shop, mother and daughter, 20 years of silence between them, and Diep had just asked the question that could unlock all of it. Her mother took a slow breath. She looked down at her hands, and then she began. She spoke quietly at first, about a life Diep had never seen, about a young woman who had made choices under pressure she couldn't explain to a child, about Mr. Hoan, a man who had controlled things in ways that left her feeling trapped, about fear, about shame, about a decision made in the worst kind of darkness that she had spent 20 years wishing she could undo. Diep listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She just listened, the way James had listened to her just the night before. And here's what nobody tells you about listening. It doesn't mean agreeing. It doesn't mean forgiving right away. It just means giving someone the space to be human, flawed and broken and human. Her mother's voice cracked more than once. She pressed her hands flat on the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. At one point she said, "I thought leaving was protecting you from something worse. I was wrong. I know I was wrong." Diep looked at her for a long moment. "I spent years making wishes on shooting stars," Diep said slowly. "Do you know what I wished for?" Her voice was calm, clear. "I wished you would wake me up in the morning. That Dad would call me his dear daughter. Just once." Her mother closed her eyes. A tear ran down quietly. "I never got that wish," Diep said. "Not once." The silence after that was heavy, but not angry. It was the silence of two people finally saying the true things out loud. What I love about this moment is that Diep came back not to wound, but to be witnessed. She needed her mother to truly understand what that childhood felt like. Not to punish, but to be seen. And something remarkable is happening here. By speaking her pain honestly, Diep is actually beginning to release it. She is setting down a weight she has been carrying since she was small enough to chase shooting stars. Her mother reached across the table slowly. She didn't grab Diep's hand. She just placed her own hand nearby, an offering, not a demand. "I don't expect you to forgive me today," her mother said softly. "I don't even expect you to forgive me at all. But I need you to know, every single day for 20 years, I thought about you. Every day." Diep looked at her mother's hand on the table. She didn't take it, but she didn't move away either. "I have a family now," Diep said quietly. "James and Nee. They are my family. They are enough for me." Her mother nodded. "I'm glad," she said, and she meant it. "But I don't want to carry this anger forever," Diep continued. Her voice was very quiet now. "It's heavy, and I'm tired." And then something shifted in the air between them. Very small, very gentle, like the first crack of light through a window that has been shut for too long. Diep looked up. "I'm not ready to call you mother," she said, "but I'm not walking away today. And what I believe is coming next will be the most tender moment of all." Diep walked home slowly that afternoon. Not because she was sad, but because she needed the time. The fields were green on both sides of the path. The air smelled like earth and sunshine, and something sweet from the guava trees nearby. She walked, and she thought, and she let herself feel everything that had just happened. It was not a resolution, not yet, but it was something. A door, slightly open, just enough to let a little light in. When she reached the house, Nee came running from the garden. "Mom, come look. I found a really big guava." "It's the biggest one I've ever seen." She grabbed Diep's hand without even pausing. Diep let herself be pulled. She laughed, not the careful, surprised laugh from before. A full, easy laugh. James appeared in the doorway. He looked at her face, and he understood immediately. Not everything was fixed, but something important had moved. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Nai has been guarding that guava for 2 hours. She refused to let anyone touch it until you came home." "It's for Mom," Nai said seriously, "because she went somewhere important today." Diep crouched down to Nee's level. She looked at this small girl who called her Mom so easily, so naturally, as if it had always been true, and something warm moved through her chest. "Thank you, Nai," she said softly. "This is the best guava I've ever seen." Nee beamed. "I know," she said proudly. That evening, the three of them sat together on the porch as the sun went down. Nee fell asleep between them, her head on Diep's arm. James and Diep sat quietly in the fading light. She told me things, Diep said finally. Things I didn't know before. James nodded and waited. I'm not ready to forgive her, Diep said. But I think I understand her a little more than before. And I told her I'm not walking away. She paused. I think that's enough for now. James reached over slowly. He covered her hand with his. The same gesture as the day before, steady, unhurried. That's more than enough, he said. This is the part that gives me the most hope. Diep didn't go back to fix everything. She went back to free herself. And she is doing it step by step, with James beside her and Nee in her arms. This is what healing inside a family looks like. Not one big dramatic moment, but small, brave steps taken by a woman who finally believes she deserves to be whole. The stars came out one by one above the countryside. Nai was breathing softly in sleep, and Diep looked up at the sky, at all those tiny lights. And she thought about a little girl who used to wish on shooting stars. That little girl wished for a mother who would wake her up in the morning, for a father who would call her his dear daughter. She never got exactly that wish, but look at what she had instead. A man who peeled corn cakes for her with both hands. A little girl who saved the biggest guava in the whole orchard just for her return. Sometimes, life doesn't give us what we wished for. It gives us something we couldn't have imagined. And what I believe comes next will be the most beautiful moment of all, because there is still one thing left unfinished, one door not yet fully opened. And when Diep finally finds the courage to walk through it, I think it will change not just her heart, but everything.